Good afternoon. This is DebraVWilson. It is Monday, the 25th of November, 2019, and I am in London. I thought I would do this podcast. I had intended on going to a talk at in at LSE. It's a brilliant talk, but when I thought about it, it's not necessarily the scope. It's outside of my scope of my research. So this is going to be one of my stream of consciousness podcasts. So I hope you bear with me. I am staying in Greater London. I'm not going to name the community I'm in, but the street my accommodation hotel is on is the same street, has the same name of the street I used to live, my home, what was my home in Chicago. So seeing the street that the hotel is located on, the hotel is expansive, and the part of the hotel I'm in, that's the one familiar with the similar name. So it brought back a flood of memories and made me, and all the memories about grief, the loss of how I constructed myself as an American. Okay. And identity. So I had to leave the place I called home for over a decade in Chicago because the FBI put an informant in there, a doorman. And I was near 53. He was 23. He was white. When I reported him, and they got, and in addition, some people intervened and stopped his behavior. He assaulted me according to Illinois law because he put his hands on me. A woman showed up to protect him from me, the person he assaulted. But when I would walk through the door to come in home in the evenings, the door with a building with the doorman, and he was the doorman, he would question me about my association with MI5 in London. Seriously, I didn't know this doorman. I've never had any association with MI5 at London, not at that point, and the questions were obviously not random, and they didn't make sense. This young man also exhibited quite predatory behavior toward females. I complained to my elected officials in Illinois to no avail, and I complained to elected officials in the U.S. To no avail, and I ended up having to leave the U.S. That was in 2010, and I've been moving around ever since. So, seeing this, it um, it makes me think about the fact that I didn't expect any of this to happen, and how life might not necessarily turn out the way you think it's going to turn out. So, as I do, people often talk to me, random people, not about MI5, but they do, no matter where in the world I go, people talk to me. And there was a woman on the street who I assumed was homeless, and she is, and I went out to get my dinner, and she spoke to me, and we exchanged a conversation about religion. On my way back to the hotel, I saw her again, and she was in this quite acrimonious discourse with this young man. So having the brief quote unquote engagement with her, I sided with her, and he immediately, this well-dressed man, said, ask her, I tried to help her. And he was telling me he himself was homeless. The council here in this particular borough had housed him. His marriage broke down, and his ex-wife has the children, custody of the children, and primary custody of the children. And so she got the house. And seriously, this people do tend to share with me in any case. But and he asked me to walk with him. In the brief period we walked, he told me about his life, and he had no ulterior motive. Um, I told him he sounded quite educated, and I always like to be discreet and confidential with what people tell me, unless they say otherwise. He has a postgraduate degree at the master's level. He was indeed quite educated. The woman, the homeless woman I spoke to earlier, that was in a lack of less than harmonious conversation with this gentleman. She equally sounded intelligent and educated. I know you don't need to be educated to be intelligent, but she did sound quite educated. And I looked at her, and although she wasn't as insightful about self as this young man was, because he talked about the fact, I never thought I would be homeless, because he kept saying it over and over again, I'm homeless, like he was still reconciling his new identity. But nevertheless, she was homeless. She's someone's child. She is someone that someone in her life had aspirations for, and it wasn't on the streets of Greater London asking for drug money to buy her drugs. So it made me think about the ways in which your identity in the course of your life changes. In this situation that has been significantly unpleasant for me, I do have some rather odd, but nevertheless amazing things that have happened to me. I am gifted intellectually. My particular skill set is an acute and intense understanding of relational dynamics. And I brought it to my career in Chicago and for a bit in Madison, Wisconsin, in accounting and forensics work around accounting and human resources, which is management of people, care of people, the corporate level or organizational level. In the United Kingdom, in London, my activist career was always understanding the whole of an entity, in this case, British society, all the pieces that make up my scope as national security. So understanding from the top-down perspective what the state believes itself to be doing, and then from a bottom-up perspective, how people, namely specifically civil society, experiences how the state is producing around national security, and then how that relational dynamics works itself out, and what the relational the dynamics between those two entities, how that impacts further than goes on to impact national security. I've always been transparent about the fact that many years ago, SO15 reached out to me and asked if they could see the research I was doing. And I didn't want to do that because I didn't want to do that. The primary reason I didn't want to do it is because in my research, I was critical of some of their efforts. They assured me what they wanted to see was my feedback. It was quite the amazing experience. So, warts and all, less than positive and all, they saw my research I was doing in civil society. Because of my work experience on an activist level, with SO15, I ended up meeting Israeli intelligence, the Shin Bet, which is the Israeli equivalent of MI5, it's an internal spying mechanism in Israel. And then I met Canada's Security Intelligence Service. I've met other pieces of the national security model in the UK, Israel, and Canada, just to name a few. I did end up meeting MI5, which I've posted other videos about. So I never expected that to be a part of my identity. I always thought I would go to Israel because my father, who served in the Second World War, actually was stationed, and one of the places he was stationed was in this country. He was stationed in Western Europe, and my dad had a pleasant interaction with some French uh, resistance fighters who, according to my dad, went on to Israel. And some of these young men at that time, went on to Israel and had played a role in the national security in the state of Israel. So I always knew that I was going to go to Israel to visit, certainly not under the circumstances I did. But I did. I've been to Israel twice and I have every intention of going back some more. Like SO15, the encounter that I have had with the state of Israel has been, if we want your full self, don't sanitize it because we are who we are. Tell us what you think of what we're doing. That's amazing to be able to have that space. The same space was offered to me in Canada, and the work I'm doing, the work I did here initially was from a civil society perspective, and I'm moving into doing academic. My work is academically based these days, and so that's the work I would do. Academic research in Israel, and academic research around any of my findings in Canadian national security. I find it particularly fascinating comparing Canada, my apologies, Israel and the United Kingdom, because I think make what you will of how the countries each countries respectively have found themselves in the security situation they're in. I think both countries are security states. I think the Israelis have been more upfront with their people. I think because of academics and civil society in this country, I think the security apparatus is more transparent, big fat quotes, than they've ever been. When I started here 30 years ago, coming to this country, MI5 and MI6 were a whisper, and the workings of a piece of the Metropolitan Police, people only alluded to it. So there's more transparency now than it's ever been. I think, and I'm glad, I'm looking for more transparency, but I'm very happy about that. I did say this was going to be a stream of consciousness. So I'm thinking about, and I forgot the other piece. At the tail end of the 1990s, I lived in Dundalk, in a provisional IRA community because of an engagement, and traumatic experience, but nevertheless, the experience broadened my insights into people who are fighting for self as they define self. In my mind, the only them versus us paradigm that I thought that existed was between white Americans and black Americans. And years ago, I'm always embarrassed to say, once a Nigerian taxi driver in London said to me, it must be very confusing after I told him I was from Chicago, this business with I'm paraphrasing, the British and the Irish. He said, I think the British hate the Irish more than they hate us, meaning black people. And I said, yeah, I don't get it. What's the big deal? They're all white people. I'm not that person. And I got it. I got it. I got to see, I always say, because of the community I lived in, I got to see the messiness of a conflict, a war. I know it's legal definition is a low-level conflict. I think it was a war. That's my personal opinion. A civil war. But nevertheless, I got to see two factions who I believe personally were exhausted and ready to come up with a political solution. It's not a perfect solution, and it's one that takes perpetual work, but definitely they were ready for a solution. To have had the opportunity, unplanned, to meet people who were in the front line of the troubles, including the Garda, the Irish police. For a time, I thought it was the worst thing that ever happened in my life. Most recently, for the last few years, I think it was a gift. The opportunity to see the vulnerability, not a word you associate with a provisional IRA, but nevertheless, the vulnerability as it worked itself through to stand down and reposition itself from being a paramilitary group to a political group, Sinn Féin. And have that Sinn Féin be their primary, because Sinn Féin has existed for decades. But to have Sinn Féin be the primary identity and their only identity for the provisional IRA, and seeking to return the island of Ireland to her whole self. So I always want to be accurate. I'll try my best to believe I'm accurate in expressing things, the opinions of others, and how they see self. So that gave me an experience, seeing how people's identities change, working through identities, out of your change of identities, change out of necessity or decision, or maybe it's out of your control, but you pick up new identities. So I did, again, stream of consciousness. So the street that this hotel is located on, it's prompted all of this because the nature of our existence is one of survival. And thankfully, most of us are centered in that spark that we will survive. I will survive. And so you take on identities that you never thought you would. So here goes. Asking the Israelis for help and getting it. Asking Canadian intelligence for help and getting it. Coming back to this country with a really low opinion of MI5 and saying, I don't know if I can get back in the country, and asking immigration, are you going to stop me from getting back in the country? And he said, I've asked you a series of questions. You've answered them positively from my perspective. I have no intention of stopping you from coming back to this country. And then once I got in the country, I reached out to MI5 via email, for real. And I asked if they would meet with me because I wanted to discuss this bad experience. They said that wasn't possible. They said some other things that I won't repeat, nothing bad, but they thanked me for the email. See what I'm saying? So, my identity, certainly not what I thought I would be doing, writing MI5 an email to say, I want to sit and talk with you about what happened. So I didn't sit and talk with them, but I did sit and talk with another former spy, not an MI5. That was very productive. I think I'm going to wrap this up. But today, when I saw the street, I'm not that person anymore. I'm not. I'm the person now who reached out to MI5. Who the hell does that, huh? And I'm Muslim. Who the hell reaches out to the MI5 and says, I want to talk to you? I reached out to Israeli intelligence for help. And I reached out to Canadian intelligence, and that's a big one. That trumps MI5 here and the Shabbat in Israel, because I didn't even know about Canadian intelligence. That's a whole other podcast. So I became officially the woman who talks to spies. Who knew? And when I moved into my flat in Chicago, the street I shall not name, I wasn't the woman who talked to spies. I was the woman who was an accountant, who was an HR person who on a regular basis also did forensics work. I was a woman who is the globe trotter, still am, Allah Akbar. I was a woman who was doing activism in the UK. And by the way, my activism didn't start around national security. It was about women's personal safety. And I did not at that time attach that to national security as I do now. As being women's safety as being reflective of national, the acuity of the national security model. I didn't make that connection. I do now. So identities change, they shift. And it's not always easy, but yeah, I sent MI5 an email saying I wanted, who the hell does that, right? I guess I do. The woman who talks to spies. Thank you very much.